Welcome to a webinar about understanding BC's Personal Information Protection Act, or PIPA for short. If you're a physician or MOA working in a private practice, this webinar is for you. Consent is required for collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. Different types of consent are express or opt-in, which is given by an informed person voluntarily and can be done verbally or in writing, but it's always best to get it in writing. Implied or opt-out, which is given by an informed person voluntarily, but there's no need for express consent because it's obvious why it's needed. In some cases, you might want to notify a patient that you'll be handling their personal information differently, giving them a period of time to opt out of the new process. Implied consent usually extends to party-supervised care to a patient and form a part of their circle of care, like specialists, referring physicians, and lab technologists. The collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by physicians for delivery of care is generally authorized under PIPA on the basis of implied consent. Considerations are that deception should never be used to obtain consent. A patient or employee can withdraw their consent, but they need to understand the impact. You need to obtain consent to use personal information for a new purpose, and you can't withhold services to someone failing to consent. In a clinical office, you may ask a new patient for their name, birth date, contact information, and personal health number verbally, and only require consent in writing if it relates to communicating with them electronically or using their medical data for research. But when information stays inside the circle of care, you can rely on implied consent. Where do you start? Identify situations when personal information is shared outside the circle of care. For example, patients should know if their information is being shared for secondary purposes, and both patients and employees should know if you've outsourced any processes and if their data is held outside Canada. Document how you get consent for other purposes, from a legal guardian, or from a POA. Make sure your consent forms are easy to find and understand, and they describe how information will be used and shared. When obtaining consent, respect the sensitivity of the information when asking for it in person, quietly so others in the waiting room can't hear. Have a process to identify a caller by asking 2 or 3 pieces of information only they would know, and have safeguards in place for electronic consent. If you take reasonable measures to obtain consent, you're fine. You don't need to go overboard. Check with your EMR vendor about masking options. For more information, see Guidelines for Consent and Masking Options in the Privacy Toolkit. Links to these resources are in a PDF document on the Webinars page of the Privacy Toolkit. College Standards and Guidelines, Doctors of BC Privacy Toolkit and Webinar Notes, and Privacy Commissioner Guides, Tips, and Resources. Let us know if you have any questions about complying with PIPA.